In 1905, at a meeting in Chicago, a radical labor leader and socialist named Big Bill Haywood picked up a piece of loose board and hammered on the table to call to order the first convention of a new organization. Fellow workers, this is the Continental Congress of the Working Class. We are here to confederate the workers of this country into a working class movement that shall have for its purpose the emancipation of the working class from the slave bondage of capitalism. By 1917, this organization was the most powerful radical force in the United States. They were universally regarded as a menace by the elite. The New York Times called them the most serious menace the present system of society has ever been called upon to face. William King, a senator from Utah, said, "Perhaps there is no greater menace to the internal peace and domestic tranquility of our country than this diabolical organization." Even President Woodrow Wilson called them a menace to organized society and said that they were certainly worthy of being suppressed. What is this organization that struck so much fear into the hearts of the powerful? Why were they so afraid of them? And what can they teach the labor movement of today? This is the IWW.
The IWW stood for Industrial Workers of the World.
They want to try to organize all workers.
They were talking about building one big industrial union to put the working class in charge of the means of production, more or less without regard to capitalist masters. They're just going to take it over.
IWW stands for Industrial Workers of the World. It's a union, but their goal isn't to just improve conditions for one particular trade, like teachers or electricians. Their goal is to unite all workers into one big union. The Industrial Workers of the World, or Wobblies as they came to be called, were officially founded in 1905 in Chicago. William Haywood, or Big Bill as he was known, was a large man who was blind in one eye from a childhood accident. He was a leader of the Western Federation of Miners, and he was the one to lead the first convention. From this very first meeting, the IWW made it clear that they would organize all workers. Despite being founded in the Jim Crow era, a time of extreme racism and bigotry in the United States, the Wobblies advocated for the rights of black people. They condemned the racist violence that black people faced at the time, as well as their unfair economic conditions and lack of civil rights. The American Federation of Labor, the national federation that governed labor unions of the time, refused to allow black workers to join their unions. Haywood, on the other hand, encouraged white workers to join hands and organize with black workers, even in cases where it would be illegal. When he learned that black and white members of the Brotherhood of Timber Workers were organized into separate locals in accordance with Jim Crow laws, he urged them to unite, saying, "If it is against the law, this is one time when the law should be broken." Other anti-racist activists of the time recognized the IWW as being a very rare example of an organization that fought back against the era's brutal racial prejudice. Mary White Ovington, one of the founders of the NAACP, wrote that there are two organizations in this country that have shown that they do care about full rights for black people. The first is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The second organization that attacks segregation is the Industrial Workers of the World. The IWW has stood with black people. Even the legendary writer and civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois praised the IWW, writing in The Crisis, the official publication of the NAACP, "We respect the IWW as one of the social and political movements in modern times that draws no color line." The Wobblies' inclusivity also extended to immigrant workers. They organized Chinese, Mexicans, Finns, Italians, Slavs, and every other nationality all together as one. Many of these ethnicities were excluded by the AFL, leaving the IWW as their only means of mass organizing. The IWW accepted these immigrant workers happily, and made great efforts to translate IWW newspapers and literature into as many languages as possible. Although no one knows for sure where the name Wobbly originated, the most common theory is that it came from a mispronunciation from a sympathetic Chinese restaurant owner, pronouncing the name as I Wobble Wobble. It should be no surprise that the IWW worked to organize women as well. Women led some of the IWW's most famous strikes, like the Bread and Roses strike of 1912 and the Patterson Silk strike of 1913. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was one of those leaders, and one of the union's best organizers. In response to criticisms of these strikes that the Wobblies were hiding behind women, she said, "The IWW has been accused of putting women in the front. The truth is, the IWW does not keep them at the back, and they go to the front." Women didn't get the right to vote in the U.S. until 1920, and Lucy Parsons, a woman of mixed race and an IWW founder, described the conditions for women in a speech to the Union's founding convention by saying, "We, the women of this country, have no ballot even if we wish to use it. We have no ballot, but we have our labor." She went on in that same speech to warn her fellow workers that the fight ahead would not be easy. Speaking of the capitalist class, she said, "It has many weapons to fight us. First, it has money. Then it has legislative tools. Then it has its judiciary. It has its army and its navy. It has its guns. It has its armories. And last, it has the gallows. We call ourselves revolutionists. Do you know what the capitalists mean to do to you revolutionists?" Haywood also gave a similar warning in his opening address to the founding convention. He said, "When the corporations and the capitalists understand that you are organized for the express purpose of placing the supervision of industry in the hands of those who do the work, you are going to be harassed and you are going to be subjected to every indignity and cruelty that their minds can invent." Unfortunately, Big Bill and Lucy Parsons were both right. Members of the IWW faced incredible violence and repression from wealthy capitalists and the government. They were regularly beaten, tarred and feathered, framed for crimes, run out of town, kidnapped, deported, tortured, and murdered. Private agents working for the wealthy infiltrated their meetings, gathered information, and sowed discord and divisiveness from within. Congress made brand new laws for the specific purpose of destroying the IWW, and the justice system refused to punish any of the many acts of extreme violence against the Wobblies. It's safe to say that the ruling class used every tool at their disposal to try and destroy the IWW. And yet, they're still around today, and their message is still just as relevant as ever. So what led to this violent crackdown of the IWW? Why were they seen as such a threat to the rich and powerful? To understand this, let's take a look at a few moments in Wobbly history that can help explain why the elites came to fear the one big union. Between 1907 and 1916, the IWW engaged in about 45 different campaigns to protect free speech throughout the United States. One of the main ways the Wobblies tried to get their message out and recruit new members was by giving speeches, singing, and holding meetings on street corners. They especially targeted areas around employment agencies, where sharks sold jobs that often didn't even exist. They urged workers, "Don't buy jobs," and demanded that employers hire directly through union halls. In Missoula, Montana, in an effort to stamp out Wobblies who were spreading their philosophy through speeches to crowds of people in the streets, the city council made street speaking illegal. In response, hundreds of Wobs came by boxcar from all around the country. One by one, they got on top of soapboxes and made speeches until they were hauled off to jail. Through mass civil disobedience, they flooded the jails until the city ran out of room and money to keep going. The street-speaking ban was lifted, and the Wobblies were released. This is broadly how the free speech fights went. A city, generally pressured by big businesses who were terrified of the IWW, would outlaw street speaking to try and prevent them from recruiting new members. The IWW would call on its rank and file to travel to the city and engage in mass civil disobedience until the city relented and removed the ban. In Spokane, Washington, a prominent member of the IWW named Frank Little was jailed for 30 days for just reading the Declaration of Independence. As these free speech fights spread throughout the country, the response from wealthy business owners became more and more severe. One of the most brutal of these free speech fights happened in San Diego in 1912. The same day that San Diego enacted their ban on street speaking, over 2,000 activists, Wobblies, anarchists, socialists, and others, went to defy the ban. Within the week, hundreds had been jailed. The San Diego Tribune called for the execution of all the men in the jails, which they claimed would end the trouble in about an hour. They made their feelings very clear, saying, "Hanging is none too good for them, and they would be much better dead, for they are absolutely useless in the human economy. They are the waste material of creation and should be drained off into the sewer of oblivion, there to rot in cold oblivion like any other excrement." In addition to the extreme language used by the news media, local businessmen organized violent mobs which would seize these prisoners once they were released from jail, load them into cars, drive them out of town, and viciously beat them as they warned them to never come back to San Diego. They even targeted and kidnapped people in the media who were insufficiently anti-IWW, like the editor of the San Diego Herald who had opposed the actions of the mobs. The legendary anarchist writer Emma Goldman had come to San Diego to give lectures and support the IWW's fight for free speech. Her lover was a man named Dr. Ben Reitman, a physician who gave medical care for the poor. He was known as the Hobo Doctor, and he even founded the Hobo College in Hobohemia. Yes, that is real. He gave his services to destitute social outcasts, including abortion, which was illegal at the time, and birth control. When Emma Goldman and Dr. Reitman arrived at San Diego, their hotel was surrounded by one of these large mobs. Hundreds of them entered the hotel and threatened to attack the hotel manager and all of the guests unless they gave up Goldman and Reitman. Reitman was taken, and he was beaten, stripped naked, sexually abused, tarred and feathered, and had the letters IWW burned into his skin. After his torture in San Diego, Dr. Reitman wrote a piece in Mother Earth called The Respectable Mob, in which he said, "I'm beginning to understand that which is difficult for every American to appreciate, namely that there is only as much freedom in America as the authority and property interests are willing to grant. And it is very plain to me now that whenever the police permit too much free speech, the capitalist class will step in and take matters into its own hands." Our San Diego experience not only burned industrial unionism into my flesh, but also engraved on my heart and soul that this is a country of the master class, and that the latter controls free speech. In relating my experience, I want our readers to know that that which was done to me was done in a measure to 300 other men, mostly members of the IWW. Comrade Joseph McAllisek was wantonly killed by a policeman's bullet. Michael Hoey, an IWW man, was knocked down by a stream of water and died soon after. An innocent child was washed out of a buggy by a hose held by the police and killed. Nearly 400 men have been jailed on charges varying from vagrancy to murder. Practically all of those men were innocent. 300 men have been beaten, kidnapped, and forced to undergo Spanish Inquisition tortures. The vigilantes and police have had a great deal of fun. None of them has been as much as slapped on the wrist. These free speech fights showcase the IWW's ability to mobilize what they called the Army of Production. They're able to call upon supporters from all around the country to target unjust laws with concentrated nonviolent civil disobedience. People were so inspired by the IWW's mission that they were willing to make long journeys with the intention of getting themselves thrown into jail, knowing that they would very likely have to withstand mob violence and perhaps even torture. Without a doubt, this ability to mobilize the working class terrified the ruling class. In August 1913, almost 3,000 men, women, and children were camped in a hop ranch in California. They'd come looking for work after the owner of the ranch, a man named Ralph Durst, put out newspaper advertisements asking for 2,700 hop pickers. When the workers arrived, they found that Durst had advertised for twice as many pickers as he actually needed. So, with a surplus of poor and desperate workers, he was able to drastically cut wages for those he did hire. The conditions for the hop pickers were abysmal. They didn't even have a roof to sleep under. Many workers rented tents or even rented piles of straw from Durst just to have somewhere to sleep. Many others would just sleep out in the field. They picked hops for long hours in extreme heat, with temperatures rising to 116 degrees at the time, and they weren't allowed to bring drinking water with them into the fields. The only way to get water was to walk to a well a mile away or buy cheap artificial lemonade sold by Durst's cousin at outrageous prices. In addition to non-existent housing and little access to water, the sanitary conditions for workers at the ranch were a nightmare. There were only 8 outdoor toilets in total. 8 outhouses with no doors. 8 for nearly 3,000 people. There were only 8 toilets. Unsurprisingly, these toilets were constantly overflowing with excrement and became a breeding ground for flies. Because of all these horrible conditions, dysentery, as well as many other diseases, became widespread. And seeing as one of the main symptoms of dysentery is bloody diarrhea, having almost 3,000 people, many with dysentery, sharing 8 outhouses, must have been absolutely horrific. Shortly after workers had arrived at the ranch and witnessed how bad the conditions were, about 30 of them started an IWW local. Within 3 days, these 30 Wobblies had mobilized the 2,800 workers at the ranch, organized a mass meeting, and made a list of demands. They wanted better sanitary conditions, separate toilets for men and women, drinking water in the fields twice a day, and an increase in wages. 2 of the people leading the organization efforts, Richard Ford and Herman Surr, were Wobblies involved in the free speech fights in Fresno and San Diego. In a mass meeting held on August 3rd, Ford suggested that workers consider a general strike. Durst certainly had the money to pay decent wages and to improve living conditions. After all, he was the single largest employer of agricultural workers in the entire state. But instead of making a deal, Durst called in the local district attorney, the sheriff, and his deputies to come arrest Ford and put a stop to any IWW organizing. While workers were singing an IWW song together, a group of deputies stormed the speaker's platform to arrest Ford, and another deputy fired his shotgun in the air. After the gunshot, fighting broke out between the workers and the deputies. 4 were killed in the chaos that ensued: the district attorney, a deputy sheriff, and 2 workers. Even though the deputies had started the violence, officials were quick to blame the entire ordeal on the IWW. Ford and Surr were charged with leading the strike and convicted of second-degree murder. They were sentenced to life in prison. They would eventually be released, but only after a massive campaign by the IWW. In total, they spent over a decade behind bars for the crime of trying to advocate for workers. What scared the ruling class about the Wheatland Hop Riot was not only the speed that Wobblies were able to organize such a large group of people, but also what happened in the aftermath of the whole ordeal. In the year after the riot, 40 new IWW locals started in California. Wobblies agitated throughout the state, fighting with every weapon at their disposal. They encouraged a boycott of the hop fields until Ford and Surr were released and conditions for workers were improved. They advocated the use of slowdowns, the conscious withdrawal of efficiency, and whatever other means that they could think of. Big Bill explained the IWW strategy when he said, "The capitalist has no heart, but harpoon him in the pocketbook and you will draw blood." They estimated that their actions had cost California elites like Durst $10 million a year, while the farmers themselves said that the number was between 15 and 20 million. When adjusted to today's value, that's between $484 and $646 million per year. This massive blow to the wealthy business owners convinced them that the IWW could indeed do serious damage, and struck fear into the hearts of the employer class. The last straw that cemented the IWW's status as enemy number 1 of the U.S. government was a series of strikes in the lumber and copper industries. After having massive success organizing harvest workers in the previous 2 years, the IWW formed the Agricultural Workers Organization, or AWO. It was the first example of a really large, impactful industrial union within the umbrella of the IWW, and at its largest, the AWO alone had at least 22,000 members, with some estimates as high as 100,000 members. The AWO gave the IWW a huge surge of energy and, importantly, dues-paying members. With this momentum and increased funding, they made a big organizing push in the lumber and copper industries. Conditions in lumber camps were notoriously terrible. Traveling from camp to camp, workers carried rolled-up blankets on their backs, since their employers didn't provide any bedding. They were crammed into bunkhouses like sardines, with 40 loggers packed in a house that really couldn't accommodate more than a dozen. They slept two to a bunk, and the bunks weren't real beds, but rather wooden frames filled with hay. The food that they were given was cheap and rotten. Sanitary conditions were abysmal, and at least half of the logging camps had no bathing facilities and no place to wash or dry clothes. The IWW formed the Lumber Workers Industrial Union at their 1917 convention, and the Wobbly Lumberjacks went on strike. They wanted higher wages, good food, clean kitchens, real beds and showers, no work on Sundays, an 8-hour day, and an end to child labor in the sawmills. The lumberjacks faced fierce resistance from the employers and their allies in the government. They refused negotiation with Wobblies, who they called a lot of treasonable, anarchistic agitators. Police searched people on streets and trains looking for a red union card, signifying IWW membership. They held Wobblies in stockades and raided their union halls. They arrested strike leaders and hired crews of scabs to replace striking workers. Local lawyers refused to defend imprisoned Wobblies, and local senators urged the use of military force to drive IWW members out of the lumber camps. The lumber barons raised $500,000 to break the strike, which is equal to almost $13 million today. Despite the resistance from the bosses, the lumber strike was successful. As one lumberjack described in 1919, "Before the strike, a lumberjack wasn't a man. He was a lousy animal. We struck for an 8-hour day and decent human conditions, and we won the strike. Now a lumberjack is a man." When asked how they won the strike, the lumberjack explained, "By solidarity. When we learned that lesson, we never forgot it. We went out together and we came back together. That's what the lumber bosses couldn't fight. And then, of course, we learned some new tricks about striking. Ever hear of the intermittent strike? Well, we tried that. Our funds were getting low, so we decided to strike on the job. A bunch of us would go back to work. The bosses were glad to see us, thought we'd given up. And then, well, the rules and regulations aren't usually observed very well when you're at work. We observed them. It certainly did slow things up. Everything went wrong. And then, to finish, somebody would institute the 8-hour day by pulling the whistle 2 hours before quitting time. Naturally, everybody stopped work. The bosses had a fit and fired us, so we moved on to the next camp and wired headquarters to send another bunch to the last place. It certainly worked. I never saw a more peaceful strike in my life than that one, and I've seen some strikes."
The strike on the job, in my estimation, was the best tactic that ever came out of the IWW. Better than the sit-down strikes later, because the workers stayed on the job and got their pay, but they slowed production down sometimes 50%. And that soon brought the bosses to their knees, quicker than anything else ever did. We were striking for the 8-hour day, and we got it. And the Knights of Labor had failed, the AFL had failed. We made it in the IWW.
After they won their strike and got the 8-hour day, lumberjacks burned their old bedding rolls in celebration so that employers would have to provide bedding or have no workers. In June of 1917, a fire broke out in a mine in Butte, Montana. The mine collapsed, trapping and killing 167 miners in one of the worst mining disasters in history. The miners said that Anaconda, the massive company that owned the mines, showed a complete disregard for safety regulations that led to the high death count. In the wake of the tragedy, 14,000 miners immediately went on strike for better safety provisions and higher pay. In solidarity with the copper strike in Butte, miners in Bisbee, Arizona, went on strike as well. The IWW had started a branch there the previous year, and due to a good deal of local organizing, they had well over 2,200 members in Bisbee. The mining workforce in Bisbee was largely segregated, with white people working as miners and earning around $5.35 for an 8-hour shift, and Mexicans working as surface laborers, earning less than half of that, about $2.15. The IWW demanded a fixed pay rate of $6 a shift for miners and $5.50 for surface workers, which would have more than doubled the wages for Mexicans. They demanded safer working conditions and an end to discrimination against immigrants and minority workers. Virtually all of the Mexican workers in Bisbee joined the strike. In both the lumber camps and the copper mines, the IWW made major progress in organizing extremely significant industries. In fact, their successes were perhaps too great. In many areas of the Pacific Northwest, 90 to 95% of the lumberjacks became members of the IWW. The mines that the Wobblies went on strike in accounted for almost half of the nation's copper production, at a time when the U.S. produced 65% of the copper for the entire world. This success is exactly what led the government to try and destroy the IWW once and for all. In April of 1917, the United States officially declared war on Germany, marking America's entry into World War I. The lumber and copper strikes started a few months later, in June and July. Both wood and copper were extremely important to the U.S. war effort. They were needed to produce airplanes, ships, guns, bullets, virtually everything involved with the war. The start of the war led Europe to buy as much American copper as possible, making prices skyrocket. The IWW, gaining sudden control over the flow of these vital materials, sent the government and the robber barons into a panic. Instead of pressuring extremely wealthy business owners to improve conditions and pay workers fairly, the government decided that they would use every tool at their disposal to stop the Wobblies and the labor movement as a whole. The propaganda effort against the IWW had already been underway for years, with the media doing whatever they could to paint the union as a bunch of bomb-throwing anarchists that were causing chaos throughout the country. As the U.S. entered the war, a new smear was added to the anti-Wobbly playbook. These strikes were all the fault of Germany. The workers weren't demanding a better life for themselves. They were seditious radicals, bent on destroying the U.S. for the sake of the Kaiser. As one headline from the New York Times read, "Big copper strike blamed on Germans. Thomas tells Senate Kaiser's agents are using the IWW in a conspiracy." This claim that the IWW was being controlled by Germany was later completely disproven, but it spread like wildfire and provided the needed justification for the coming crackdown. The wealthy had wanted the destruction of the IWW ever since its founding, and now they had an excuse. And this excuse would be used to justify extreme violence against the Wobblies throughout the country, particularly in Bisbee, Arizona, and Butte, Montana. Bisbee was essentially a company town, ruled by the copper mining company Phelps Dodge. They dominated Arizona's copper industry, and their copper mine in Bisbee was their most productive mine. Even as the company's profits skyrocketed from the increase of copper prices due to the war, they refused any negotiation with the IWW. Instead of raising wages, the copper barons organized a massive mob armed with machine guns and high-powered rifles, and rounded up 1,186 suspected Wobblies or Wobbly sympathizers. The Wobblies were forced to walk for miles with guns pointed at their heads, and were brutally assaulted, especially the Mexicans and Wobbly leaders. Then they were crammed into trains that were covered with cow manure, and deported from their homes, out into the middle of the desert, without food or supplies. Phelps Dodge's hired goons ruled the area with an iron fist for months afterwards, screening anyone who wanted to enter Bisbee and deporting anyone suspected of Union activity. The Bisbee Deportation remains the largest single mass kidnapping event in U.S. history. In Butte, Montana, Frank Little was asleep in his room. He had been a leader in many of the free speech fights and was even elected to be a member of the union's executive board. While he slept, a group of 6 masked, heavily armed men broke down his door. They took him from his room, still in his underwear, beat him, and abducted him. He was then tied to a car's rear bumper and dragged around town for so long that his kneecaps were completely scraped off. The mob then took him to a bridge by the edge of the town and hanged him. They left a note saying, "First and last warning." The note also included the initials of other Union leaders, not so subtly suggesting that they would be killed next. The people of Butte understood that the murder of Frank Little was premeditated and planned by the Copper Trust, Anaconda. The coroner had found a small hole in the back of Frank Little's head, which almost certainly came from the steel hook used on the amputated right arm of Billy Oates, a notorious gunman employed by Anaconda. Just like other cases of mob violence against the Wobblies, no one was ever prosecuted for the murder of Frank Little. Thousands of supporters attended his funeral, and it still remains the largest funeral in Butte's history. His headstone reads, "Slain by capitalist interests for organizing and inspiring his fellow men." In addition to state-sanctioned violence, the ruling class also used the power of the law to crack down on the IWW. Woodrow Wilson's administration passed the Immigration Act of 1917, which banned Wobblies from entering the country. They passed the Espionage Act, which you may be familiar with from the cases of Edward Snowden and Julian Assange. This made it a crime to interfere with the operation or success of the military or naval forces of the United States, or to promote the success of its enemies. Since the media had done so well in spreading the lie that the Wobblies were funded by German gold, the government already had all the justification that they needed. This allowed them to raid IWW headquarters and union halls around the country and arrest over 160 Wobbly leaders under the guise of protecting the country from foreign influence. But they really didn't try hard to conceal the real reason for this crackdown. The district attorney of Philadelphia described the raids as being done, quote, very largely to put the IWW out of business. Among those arrested were Ralph Chaplin, the editor of the union's official newspaper Solidarity, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and, of course, Big Bill Haywood. To further extend the crackdown on the left in America, they even passed the Sedition Act of 1918, which extended the Espionage Act to outlaw any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States. That's right, the government was so afraid of the IWW that they made it illegal to criticize the government. The revolutionary vision of one big union was such a threat to moneyed interests that the government was ready to do away with any semblance of freedom of speech in order to protect the interests of wealthy capitalists. This was used as a pretext to arrest a number of socialist leaders, including the first socialist to serve in Congress, Victor Berger, as well as IWW founder and socialist presidential candidate Eugene Debs. This broad repression of leftism in America continued into the early 1920s, with leftists regularly facing politically motivated arrests and deportations in what is now called the First Red Scare. Both the IWW and the Socialist Party were very powerful organizations throughout the 1910s. Socialists were gaining more and more seats of power in the government, and the IWW was gaining control of entire industries. But the government's campaign of repression was unfortunately quite effective at weakening the left for decades to come. Between the rampant mob violence, vicious smears in the media, and brutal government crackdown, membership in the IWW declined for decades. But despite all of the forces of capital working together to destroy the IWW completely, it has continued to survive. There were periods where the union seemed to be on life support, but it's been kept alive for over 120 years now by generations of dreamers and radicals. The history of the IWW shows how powerful the idea of one big union is, and how powerful workers can be when they unite together under one banner. They were able to mobilize workers throughout the country. They attacked the master's pocketbook to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, and they were able to gain control, even if only briefly, of entire industries. The IWW was able to do all this despite the fact that the number of members peaked in 1917 at around only 150,000. The total population of the U.S. at that time was over 114 million, so the IWW was able to become the most feared and most powerful revolutionary organization in U.S. history, despite its members only making up around 0.1% of the population. They were able to go from not existing at all to being the greatest threat that capitalism has ever seen in this country, within the span of just 12 years. Nowadays, the IWW seems to be making a comeback. They were involved with the environmentalist group Earth First in the 80s and 90s, and they were instrumental in starting efforts to unionize Starbucks workers. Membership has been on the rise, and given the current state of, everything, there are millions of people who are ready for change and looking for ways to help. All we need to do is join the one big union and start organizing. Share this video with your friends and family. Let them know about the IWW. If we want things to actually change for workers, we need to come together as one united force. Go to IWW.org, click join, and sign up to get your red card. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting me on Patreon so I can make more stuff like this. I'd love to be working on videos like this full time, and your support can go a long way into making that possible. If nothing else, please help spread this video so that more people can hear about the IWW, and we can work together on building the new society within the shell of the old. Thanks for watching. See you next time.